If you're just joining us, the country's most hotly contested elections may have come and gone, but the uncertainty remains as there is no outright winner. Political parties begin horse trading in order to form a coalition government, both at a national level, including some of the hung provinces. There are economic jitters then over the direction that the country is likely to take. To help us unpack the market's reaction, I'm joined by Professor Chris Malikane. He is Associate Professor of Economics at Wits, and Mark Kingston is the Chairperson of Business for South Africa. Gentlemen, to both of you, thank you very much for your time. Let me begin with you, Mark, if you don't mind, Professor Malikane, so that we can react to Mark Kingston. Mark, the upheavals, market upheaval, are you able to tell us whether or not you are worried about the direction that the new government will likely take? If so, what worries you most?
Well, good evening to you, Dolly, and indeed to Professor Chris Malikane. By the way, it's Martin, not Mark, but it's always nice to have a new name early in the post-election process.
Forgive me.
Of course, we are, I wouldn't say nervous. I think we are cautious, and that's what the markets will be, until we see a stable and clear direction emerge, and indeed a government that is perceived to be, as you said earlier on, market friendly. And until that is the case, people will watch and wait. We need to ensure that we're able to actually continue on the trajectory in which we found ourselves over the past 12 months in our partnership with the previous government, which was highly committed over a long period of time, I have to say, it took to emerge to structural reform and to key interventions in the economy, the work that we've been doing in partnership with the government on energy, transport and logistics, and crime and corruption. And I'm sure during the show we'll talk about some of the progress that has been made. Our working assumption has been that that will continue, obviously, in the current circumstances. And we have to commend the IEC, the fact that we had peaceful and free and fair elections. I think that's an excellent signal to everybody, democracy at work. But we have to see what will emerge in terms of the economic direction of the new cabinet when it is formed. And then we'll have to sit across the table from the president and indeed the cabinet to ensure that they can recommit themselves to a course of economic action that actually creates the necessary level of confidence and indeed security, visibility and predictability. Yeah. When I say for business, I mean both for the investment community in South Africa as well as, of course, for international providers of capital.
Let's bring it back into studio now. Professor Malikane, how big an upheaval should investors, both domestic and international, expect in this period while the government is trying to be formed?
Yeah, well, one thing that we need to understand is that the South African political economy setup is split into two large factions, right? The first one is the private sector, is those that argue for a private sector-led development path for South Africa, what we call market-friendly, right? The other is the path, are those who argue for a development path that is more state-led, you know. But it does not mean markets don't operate in that setup. It's just that it's state-led, but also geared towards addressing the historical injustices that are still plaguing the South African economy. So you've got these two camps, and when you look at the ANC really now, it is split in those two camps. You know, the camp, if it goes with the neoliberal camp, then markets will be happy, you know, because markets is the private sector in South Africa, which we know is largely untransformed. And then if the other part of the ANC says no, we prefer to move towards that path, developmental path, which addresses historical inequalities, because that's where we are now. The majority of the people are conscious that the historical inequalities, injustices have not been addressed for the past 30 years. Yeah. So that's where we are.
All right. Yeah. Martin, I think the viewer would appreciate it better if we actually spoke about this in realistic terms. Would an ANC EFF MK party coalition spook the markets and investors alike? Or, as one of the ratings agencies put it, would a DA-ANC coalition work better for the investment and business world?
But the question, and I'd go back to what Chris was saying, which is what is perceived to be market-friendly. Market-friendly, in my opinion, has two elements to it. One, of course, is how business reacts. And when we talk about business, we're talking about small and large, formal and informal, domestic and international. And we're talking about providers of capital. Providers of capital, be they banks or pension funds, again, either domestically or internationally. And they need to, whether it's business or whether it's the markets more broadly, if they're going to have confidence, they need to be comfortable that the administration they're dealing with is market-friendly. Market-friendly, by the way, does not mean that they shouldn't address or redress the problems of the past, including inequality, unemployment, and poverty. I think we all are fully committed to the need to do that, to an inclusive economic growth trajectory. But what we need to ensure is that we've got a system which respects the Constitution, which actually respects the rule of law, where we have predictability, where competition and productivity is at the heart of being able to drive economic growth. Let's not forget, Polly, that we have had less than 1% economic growth in the past 3 or 4 years, and we're not projecting more than 2% over the medium term, which is woefully inadequate for our circumstances. And if we recognize that the private sector contributes the vast majority of actually jobs, of taxes, of actually fixed investment and capital deployed, then we need to make sure that we maintain and increase that, albeit alongside the government. So in answer to your very specific question, it is clear at the moment that based upon their policies, neither MK, which is anti the current constitution, nor the EFF would engender that confidence, whereas the DA has obviously spoken about a market-friendly approach. And we actually, most importantly, need to recognize that the ANC has already embarked upon a course of action over the past 12 months in our partnership with them and for many years before, as I said, of committing to structural reform and key interventions, which we embrace and support. And that's the ANC of today, and I am sure the ANC of tomorrow.
Chris, based on that sentiment, and I think what has got to be central here is exactly what Martin is pointing to, less than 1% growth over a period now that this economy has experienced. So, is the path clear as to which coalition is better here?
Yeah, well, this 1% growth, we must understand, is a growth that came about under a political dispensation that was market-friendly. You know, in the past, if you take Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency, right? It's a market-friendly presidency, but it generated this growth rate. Unemployment rate has been on an upward trajectory. We've had massive load shedding, you know. So it's a market-friendly administration, you know. But there's an alternative to which Martin has to acknowledge that all these problems of poverty, inequality, and so forth, they are founded, you know, in a historical injustice that is not addressed, that Martin is not addressing, which is the fact that the vast majority of African people were dispossessed of the land. They don't have any control whatsoever in any single value chain in this economy. Yet they are the vast majority and they are indigenous people in this country. So it is this historical, continuous, generational, historical inequality that has brought the ANC where it is today. Yeah. So the anger that you see out there against the ANC is precisely because of the failure to address this.
Martin, can you argue against that? I'm going to actually take you back even to the Mbeki years, which produced better economic rates. However, it was said to be jobless growth. Now you have had the Ramaphosa administration, and again, it is said to be market-friendly. However, it's produced less than expected rates of growth. And in particular, we have to be mindful of the unemployment rate in the country. Those are stark historic figures, Martin. Can you argue against that?
No, I think that we absolutely have to accept the level of the challenge that exists. And I think we need to acknowledge the reality, which is that in many cases, these indicators have deteriorated since 1994, and not just the indicators that Chris has talked about. If you look at levels of literacy and numeracy, if you look at healthcare outcomes, we've seen a degeneration and a deterioration. And I need to just go back to where we've been focusing our partnership, because it's very interesting when one analyzes the role of the state and indeed the role of the private sector.
Yeah.
In the areas where we're partnering with government, by the way, at the request of government, because they acknowledge that they don't have necessarily all of the capacity, and therefore we're working to support them in terms of skills and experience. The three areas are energy. ESCOM is state-owned. Transport and logistics, Transnet is state-owned, and crime and corruption, or dealing with it, that is absolutely the domain of the state. And we respect and understand the role and responsibility of the state. What we're trying to do is ensure that we bring all of these areas both into public scrutiny, that we root out inefficiency and maladministration and corruption, that we capacitate all of these areas, critical areas of the economy, as quickly and as sustainably as possible, and that we hold everybody to account. And when I say everybody, that is both the public and indeed the private sector. And we've seen, by the way, over the past 11 months, real progress having been made. I mean, it is not by accident that load shedding has diminished. 61% year on year over the last 11 months, 80% reduction in level 4 load shedding. If we look at transport and logistics, 36% less waiting time for vessels that are anchored outside, for example, Durban. In crime and corruption, a 65% reduction in security incidents on the coal line. All inadequate, by the way, but a significant improvement. And why? Because we've mobilized significant resources, over 350 people, excluding on the security aspect of the coal line, have been mobilized to work in support of and alongside government in capacitating the state. Now, I don't see any way around that but to ensure that all of the institutions of the state are more efficient, actually meet the requirements of the people more impactfully on a sustainable basis, but acknowledging that, of course, we need to deal with the legacy issues that Chris is talking about. They are not subsidiary, they are absolute priorities, but we have to do so in a manner that we get real, sustainable, inclusive growth, targeted in particular at those who have been and still continue to be the most disadvantaged in society.
Yeah, well, that's real progress that Martin is pointing to there, Chris. But I want us to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to conclude the conversation. After the break, though, I've got to put the question to you about what the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, has had to say, trying to reassure the markets. He says that the policy, or rather the ANC, remains the biggest party. Therefore, there should be no risk to stability or threat to investor confidence. If you're just joining us, we are in the middle of a conversation about the market jitters as the reports go around a country right now that faces the prospect of being run through a coalition. The markets, inevitably, there are going to be jitters there, investors worried about their investment. To help us unpack this, we are still joined by Professor Chris Malikane, Associate Professor of Economics at Wits University. Martin Kingston is the Chairperson of Business for South Africa Group. All right, Chris, let's bring it back to you quickly. Martin pointing to a number of successes, or should we say progress, that's been made at the behest of government, which has said, business, please come in, particularly in the energy space, the logistics space. Those have been an albatross around the growth of this economy, and he is pointing to progress having been made, including fighting crime.
You know, I did some analysis of annual reports of state-owned entities, Transnet, PRASA, even ESCOM. What I found is that before 2017, they were performing very well. Some of them were generating even profits, like Transnet and PRASA. You know, the passenger transportation for PRASA was at its highest at around 2016, you know. But when the Ramaphosa administration took over, there was like a collapse, you know. So we need to ask ourselves a question from a political economy point of view.
Yeah.
Was the collapse engineered in order to justify the entry of the private sector where the state operates? Yes, Martin is saying there's progress, but on the ground, when we look at statistics, unemployment rate is rising. Poverty is grinding. To the extent that the state even committed to 350 rands subsidy to the poor.
The SRT grant.
Because the economy is incapable of feeding the population in its normal workings. So to me, it might be a success to markets, what Martin is talking about, but not to the majority of South Africans.
Martin, I've got to let you respond to that, because that's a very strong allegation that Chris is making, that this could have been engineered. He doesn't understand why this happened.
Yeah, so first of all, I have to say, I thought the exam question was, how do we provide the requisite reassurance to skittish markets in the current environment? And to do that, we need to provide policy stability, certainty, and predictability, whomsoever is the government of the day. And, for the record, Tloli, Business for South Africa and business more broadly has said, we're not supporting the ANC. We're working with the administration of the day. If it's a different administration tomorrow, we'll take stock, we'll assess whether or not they're as committed to the reforms, to the passage of necessary enabling legislation, to ensuring that the key interventions take place, as we talked about before, so that we can render many of these services, whether it be energy, whether it be, as I said, transport and logistics, whether it be rooting out maladministration, crime and corruption. By the way, at a societal level, in the private sector, in the public sector, more broadly in the community, where as a country we are seen to be failing, both by our own citizens as well as by the outside world, and that undermines investor confidence, as we have already said. Now, to suggest that somehow or other there is a plan to see the deterioration of state-owned enterprises so that the private sector can enter, I believe is completely fundamentally incorrect. The private sector actually just wants to have a stable, growing economy as a backdrop to being able to ensure that it can both act profitably and also make a contribution more broadly to macroeconomic development in the country. Because if it doesn't have that, then it creates risks for itself, which need to be taken into account when it invests for the future. And as I said previously, the private sector is the biggest generator of jobs, the biggest generator of tax, and the biggest generator of investment in the country, by the way, by a garden mile. So something like 2/3 to 80% of all of the things that I've talked about are generated by the private sector. By the way, that's both large and small.
Yeah.
And the suggestion that somehow or other this failure occurred during the most recent administration, the sixth administration, under the presidency of President Ramaphosa, and that it hadn't already taken place during the state capture years beforehand, I think we all know is just absolutely fundamentally incorrect. That the state capture years, which has now been taking on 15 years, has caused immense damage, and we're still paying the price for that as a consequence of, by the way, a lack of accountability, a lack of effective prosecution of those who have committed misdemeanors, and holding people to account both in government and outside of government. And we need to look forward if we're going to be able to provide, as I said, the reassurance to the markets, which was your question, as to how it is that as a country, harnessing all of the skills, the experience, the resources that are available in the public and the private sector, we can move forward onto the type of growth trajectory that is essential to address the very inequalities and legacies of the past that Chris has so correctly highlighted.
Yeah. Chris, I want to move the conversation forward. I suspect in this period, once again, the call for the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank to be expanded beyond inflation targeting, that's likely to come back and possibly come back very strongly. Does that help with anything?
It would help, but if the overall macroeconomic framework is not geared towards development, if we still continue with the same trajectory that creates unemployment, that reproduces poverty and fails to resolve the historical inequalities that afflicts the population and divides South Africa, then it will be like, it's not going to resolve the fundamental underlying problems. the Minister of Finance, like you put it earlier, that statement that you mentioned is interesting, where he says, the ANC is still a majority, is still the big party.
Yeah.
So therefore, markets should not be spooked,
Because the policy is going to likely remain the same.
Yeah, once he says that, it means that he's going with the DA. Because to go with the EFF or the MK party, it will mean radically changing the current trajectory of policies, So in a way, he's telling us that they are going with the DA. But the implications of that is going to be successful on condition that the neoliberal faction within the ANC is dominant, And it will be interesting to see what's going to happen to the Communist Party, COSATU, and the left within the ANC.
Wow. Martin, let's come to you. We're running out of time. Does the business community care at all about these discussions around the expansion of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, or do you think that it's political speak that really, at the end of the day, doesn't amount to much?
Well, the business community is absolutely committed to the current mandate of the Reserve Bank, as has indeed been drawn from the Constitution, and we need to have constitutional stability. We recognize that we have in the Reserve Bank, I have to say, a bastion of responsible professional leadership, which needs to be quite independent of government and the administration and the executive, as it has proved itself to be. And we welcome the fact that the tenure of the governor, the deputy governors, has been extended. Their position on this, in terms of their mandate, has been very clear. We support their position entirely, just as we recognize and respect the fact that the renewal of the Commissioner of SARS's contract also provides stability and predictability to the market as a key regulator. And I have to say our financial sector is extraordinarily well regulated and performs on a world scale compared to any other markets in the world. That is in significant part due to the functionality of the Reserve Bank. And we think that it should stick to both its regulatory role and inflation targeting as per the Constitution and as per its mandate.
Yeah. Before I come back to Chris, Martin, I'd like to get your thoughts on this quickly. Will the business community, I'm mindful of the markets, but I'm asking about the business community, will you be concerned at all if the man who leads government is not Cyril Ramaphosa? Is that a point of departure at all?
No, I think that we just need to be confident that whoever is the president embraces a market-friendly approach, is demonstrated to see his cabinet or her cabinet aligned with the policies that we support, and I think we're all familiar with that. Obviously, we've developed a good working relationship with the president. He's intimately involved in the partnership. The partnership is just one small aspect of businesses and the private sector's broader contribution to South Africa, as we said. Do I think that the markets will be unnerved? I think that they will, but that wasn't your question. Your question was about business. As I said, when the cabinet is formed, when the president is elected, we will want as business to sit across the table from the newly formed cabinet and recommit ourselves on the basis that they are equally committed to a series of economic interventions and to supporting the government and, by the way, the country, to the extent that's possible, based upon business and market-friendly policies.
Chris? Martin is very clear that the markets, yes, they will be unnerved if Cyril Ramaphosa is no longer president. However, from a business perspective, what is key is what kind of policy trajectory is going to be followed. Your view on this?
Yeah, no, he's correct, What we need to do is to move beyond personalities and to look at policies, The trajectory of policies that the ANC adopted, like I said, have been market-friendly, really, right? But whether they are people-friendly is another question, Like I kept on saying, they were and they continue to be market-friendly. When you talk about the microeconomic reforms that Martin is talking about, meaning introducing the private sector into energy production, introducing the private sector into rail, and so forth, and so including water, provision, and then limiting the role of the state in that arrangement. It's market friendly, But is it people friendly? I say my argument is not. And that is where the political, economic tension and contradiction in South Africa is at now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Chris Malikane, thank you very much for your time. He's with Wits University. And Martin Kingston, Business for South Africa chairperson, thank you indeed for your contribution.